Bow hunting whitetails is difficult. Throw in public land, add in a new state, and the odds of filling a tag are not very good. But occasionally, things work out in our favor, and those occasions are what keep us coming back as whitetail bow hunters.
I just shot a freaking giant from the ground at 5 yards, right here.
This video is a hunt breakdown of my 2021 rut hunt in Kansas, where I was able to knock down a 170-inch whitetail from 5 yards on the ground, 70 yards from his bed. This story really started back in the spring of 2021 on an extended weekend turkey hunting trip with the guys at the office. Knowing I'd be in Kansas in the fall chasing whitetails and probably being on limited time, scouting, hanging cameras, all held priority over harvesting, a real gobbler. So after driving hundreds of miles each day in an attempt to cover as much ground as possible, we were just about ready to call it quits. We had killed a couple birds, we had hung cameras, we had walked a lot of the weehaw, and we'd looked at a lot of the public with hunting access. So before we officially packed up and headed back east, there was one more piece of weehaw I had marked on my map and I wanted to make sure I checked out. The piece was isolated, it was small, about 250 acres, and it was drastically out of the way. Kind of set off by itself all alone, but it offered the only amount of cover in the area when the ag was off the fields. While the piece had abundant deer sign, it also had a lot of human sign. In fact, it had the most deer sign on it, but it also had the most people sign on it of all the pieces we had walked in that unit. And due to the human pressure, I didn't hang any cameras, and I kind of wrote the piece off and just considered it an afterthought because I didn't want to deal with human pressure on this trip. So fast forward to November 2021, I arrived in Kansas on November 7th. My hunting buddy, Clint Campbell, he was out there on November 6th, just a day ahead of me. Our cell cameras were hot on November 6th, but the weather was warm on the 7th. So I spent the entire day basically checking cameras, driving, putting new cameras out, and basically preparing myself for the next 14 days, trying to put as many odds in my favor as humanly possible. On Monday, November 8th, the temps were a lot cooler than the previous day. And while the previous day didn't have any kind of punching in the face sign thrown my way, I decided it was best just to jump in a tree, being November 8th. We had some good deer show up on camera on November 6th, the day that Clint got there. So I had picked a tree relatively close to an area where we had a cell camera, where we had a couple good bucks on camera, and basically sat there from dark to dark. And that day was relatively unfruitful. Did see a couple small bucks, but it led to some, digital scouting time and an eager attitude to cover more ground behind the glass in the days to come. So Tuesday, November 9th, the following day, was pretty exciting. I attempted a spot and stock on a pretty solid 130-inch class buck that we had glassed from the road. Being green to the spot and stock game, while it was fun, it ended in disaster, basically. Really over-aggressive, and that led me to being kind of impatient and ultimately bumping that buck out of its bed with us getting within 40 yards, where should have been more patient, should have just sat on that deer and basically watched him get up and killed him in the evening. But things worked out in my favor, I guess. Banking on that buck still being there later in the week, it's still being alive, we just kept that area kind of in our back pocket and spent the rest of the day scouting from the road because the temperatures were so hot in the afternoon. It was almost 80 degrees. There wasn't a whole lot of activity. Our cameras were dead. So we spent most of that day driving around, looking at pieces, scouting from the road, seeing where the hunting pressure was, and really just got a better grip of what was going on during that second week of November in the area. So now we're to Wednesday, November 10th. The game plan from daybreak was really to go glass a new piece of weehaw near camp and then make the hour and 45-minute trek down to the piece of weehaw that I had scouted in the spring. With that piece, having limited access only from the north, I wanted to really keep my vehicle visible on the road by passerbyers in hopes that my truck would prevent anyone from walking in on me, basically. So that choice led me to parking out in the open and led to several conversations with other resident and non-resident hunters while I was getting geared up for my afternoon hunt. As I got geared up, those conversations ended, and with limited access and how I had actually parked on the road, I had to walk around the bulk of the property to get into where I wanted to hunt. And for my spring scouting, I had known or recalled where I'd found the most deer sign and where we had actually bumped deer. And that was basically two timber fingers that jutted out into the CRP. I wanted to keep those areas clean or pressure free. So I intentionally walked several hundred yards down the road and cut basically straight into the CRP, taking a straight beeline towards the downwind edge of that second finger of timber from the main piece of timber that was following the creek. This access forced me to give up basically the back 1/3 of the property with my scent blowing that way. But knowing most of the deer sign was upwind from my entrance route, I wanted to make sure I wasn't visible, and I knew that the bulk of the property was gonna be clean and free, and with the deer being there, I felt pretty good about it. And as I got into the timber edge, I immediately got into sign, finding several rubs, found some feeding sign in a locust grove, and as I followed that sign deeper into the interior of the property, I actually bumped a couple does bedded in a really thick area. Those does were bedded in an area that was relatively unusual, and shortly I was gonna learn that they were bedded there, seeking shelter from any young bucks pestering them. I paid close attention to where those does went after I pushed them out of their safe haven, and their path took me to a very unique spot. It was an inside corner where the CRP met the timber. The timber was really only about 60 yards wide, and there were several habitats that all kind of came together in this small area. There were cedars, the CRP, timber, a flowing creek, and some topography on the back side of that creek. Now, as I made my way into that timber funnel from the inside corner, I saw a buck with his nose to the ground, and that was just maybe 50 yards or so out ahead of me. So I tucked myself into a patch of cedars and knocked an arrow, began making some ground noise, imitating a buck, making a rub or working a licking branch. And after 20 minutes of sitting there, I grew anxious, told myself I needed to be in a tree right now. I had just bumped some does. There's a hot doe in the area, and there's a buck to his nose to the ground. I just need to get set up and get ready. And as I turned towards a patch of cedars, I caught a big rub that looked to be from this year. And as I looked a little further, I saw a second rub, and I saw a third rub. As I crawled underneath a few cedars to take a better look at those rubs, what I found was really pretty remarkable. I saw no less than 12 or 13 really, really big rubs with a dirt-worn bed right smack dab in the middle. And as I was looking at this bed, looking at these rubs, knowing that the sign was from a very big deer, I knew the damage was done, so I took advantage of being there. I quickly scouted how that deer was getting into his bed across the creek, what kind of winds he could lay there with, which he could lay there with any kind of northerly wind or westerly wind, and he could lay there with a northerly wind and catch human intrusion coming from the road, but also lay there and monitor any does or other deer that were bedded in that timber finger, and know when those does were coming into heat. So as I stood there, I knew I needed to take a hard look at how that deer was exiting that bed. So I walked his exit trail. That exit trail took me through basically 60 yards of briars, thorns, deadfalls, some young plum brush that all bordered the creek, where that trail eventually took me into a more open area. And it was the same spot where the does had ran, and the same spot where I seen that buck with his nose to the ground. And when we got to that spot, the exit trail actually split. One trail went into that more open area, and then the other trail went actually across the creek into another small patch of cedars with, again, more big rubs. And this whole area was that's the Mike Tyson sign that punches you in the face that bow hunters dream of. You can't ask for anything easier to identify, anything more to enlighten you, to really have your spidey senses go off. Trees were really, really limited in the area. I couldn't do a bunch of trimming. There were a lot of locust trees with thorns, or just a bunch of giant cottonwoods or cottonwoods that were just leaned way over. You just had a really hard time getting into a tree. So I spent the next 5 hours in a makeshift ground blind, basically tucked myself in between two cedars, And I spent that afternoon watching a handful of young bucks chase the same doe to the brink of exhaustion that day. Never did see any shooters that day, but had lots of action. So I knew I needed to get back in there the next day. So Thursday, November 11th, with a hot doe in the area, I wanted to, go back in that same spot. But the last thing I wanted to do was bump that doe, especially if, overnight that doe had hooked up with, big old Kansas buck. Did not want to bump that doe out of the area because I knew that was going to be key to my success. So I purposely used gray light to walk in where I could visually see and make sure my access was clean, not only through the CRP, but also into the timber. I did not want to bump any deer on my way in that morning. Felt good about my entry. Was confident it was clean, but the morning started pretty slow. In fact, I did not have my first deer sighting until about 8:15, 8:20. That day, it was a cold day. Lows were in the 30s, highs were, I'm gonna say, in the mid 40s, but the wind was obnoxious. We had 20 plus mile an hour winds, and that's not uncommon for Kansas having a wind speed of that. But I was a little bit frustrated because I had no visual advantage because I was on the ground, and now I have no audible advantage because of the wind. It was really hard to hear. So that had me questioning my setup. But again, at 8:15, I heard some movement behind me. I ended up having a 120-inch deer sneak in across the creek. I actually heard him cross the creek. And then by the time he was up on me, he was only, 5, 6, 7 yards away. He was actually just on the backside of the cedar tree that I was set up on. And then 40 or 50 yards behind him across the creek, in kind of that open, brushy area, there was a bigger deer, a deer that I thought was probably 150 inches. And I got a really hard look at him. Looked really, really good. That whole encounter maybe lasted 2 minutes. Shortly after those two deer had walked off, I had an encounter with a small, tight rack, 115-inch deer that came through the CRP down into that pinch. So after that 30 minutes of action, I basically sat in boredom until 4 o'clock. But what happened next was probably the most exciting, adrenaline-filled hunt that I had ever experienced. After being on the ground the entire day, I was frustrated, I was pissed, I was uncomfortable. So a few times throughout the day, I literally stood up, surveyed the surrounding trees, and tried to talk myself into getting set up in an elevated position. But I kept telling myself I was in a spot, I was in the right spot, I just needed to be patient and keep my butt kind of put. With that in mind, around 3:30, I very distinctly remember, adjusting my position and breaking a few branches in that cedar tree, kind of opening up a basketball-sized window, thinking if either one of those bucks did the same thing that they did that morning, I needed to be able to shoot to the creek, which was only 10 yards behind me. So it was close quarters, but I needed to be able to have some type of shooting window in that direction. And as I sat flat on my butt, facing the direction of that bed, I had found the day before, I just basically was sitting there listening to the wind howl. And at 4 o'clock, I had a deer walk out directly in front of me. I picked up movement behind a cluster of deadfalls. There was a couple treetops that had fell, basically created a wall of brush. Picked up some movement there, and I stared at that deer for probably 3 minutes. And he's only at 13 yards, but all I can pick out is bits and pieces of his body, and I could see the deer lick its nose and stick its nose to the wind, kind of moving its head around. Not a single time did I ever see antlers, not a single time. So at that point in my mind, I was sure that I was just watching a doe wind check that area for bucks because she did not want to get pestered. After 3 minutes of that, the deer began to walk towards the creek. And again, still walking behind that wall of brush, I still could not see exactly what I was looking at. Knew it was deer, saw a brown body, but I could never get a good solid look of its body to see how big it was, nor did I see antlers at that point. So as that deer got kind of around that wall of brush, at that point in time, it decided to jump over the base of the tree, the deadfall, basically, the log portion of that deadfall. And what I saw was a Kansas giant jump over a log at 10 yards, land in my shooting window, and end up on the backside of the cedar tree. And all this is happening over to my left. So basically from, I'm gonna say 11 o'clock to 9 o'clock. So the deer that buck got to that cedar tree, And at this point, he's less than 5 yards. I mean, he's feet away from me. And he did not have a clue I was there. And I'm sitting flat on my butt. I had my bow in my hand. And with that deer off to my left, I decided, okay, I need to draw. So I drew my bow flat on my butt. And then I realized, you know, if that deer took 2 more steps, he was gonna win me. So I needed to be able to get to my feet and basically maybe not get to my feet, but get to my knees and basically be able to shoot behind me, which I could not do from my butt. It was just literally impossible. So with my bow at full draw, tucked into the cedar trees, I have cedar limbs all around me. I have a camera set up next to me, which I did not turn on. I'm trying to get to my knees. And as I get up to my knee, one knee, I realize there is basically no way this is gonna happen without me screwing it up. I'm gonna hit a branch, I'm gonna hit a camera, I'm gonna make some type of noise, and that deer is gonna bust out of here and I'm gonna blow it. So with that deer less than 5 yards away from me, I let my bow down. When I let my bow down, that deer snapped its head around. He looked, he knew there was something not right, but he had no idea. Again, he couldn't smell me, couldn't really see me. So he had really no idea what the heck was going on. And he's 70 yards from his bed. And he was a little unsure of what he was doing there at that point in time. So as that deer turned its head, it actually looked back across the creek. And I think he was thinking, oh crap, something's not right. Do I need to get on the other side of this creek and create distance, or do I need to go back to my bed, to my safe area? So as that deer turned its head, I thought now or never. I finished getting to my knees. I ripped my bow back. As I drew my bow, that deer turned around, took 5, maybe not even 5, 3 steps, I guess, back into my shooting window, and I shot him at 5 yards. High, quartering away shot, high lung, went through the opposite shoulder, and you know, with an 80-pound setup, 575 grain arrow, that arrow ended up in Colorado. Like there was no blue. I mean, I watched the arrow go through that deer and knew there was no way I was ever gonna find that arrow because it was gone. So I sat there and basically sat there in excitement for the next 30 minutes. I watched that deer go back towards its bed and felt really good, confident about the shot, felt really good about the shot. After 30 minutes, I went to impact and saw good lung blood and basically chunks of lung. So I backed out, you know, made some phone calls, called my wife, called all my buddies, and I basically waited for Clint to come in when he got done hunting at 7:30, and we went in and retrieved the deer. And the deer did exactly what I thought he was going to do after the shot. The deer tried to go back to his bed, which was only 70 yards from where I shot him, but he never made it. The deer went 50 yards, piled up, perfect shot, took out both lungs, opposite shoulder, and, you know, I guess we celebrated with a brutal 800-yard drag and the spitting rain and howling winds. But from a public land, DIY, out-of-state hunt, I'm not sure how you could ask for anything more than that. Beautiful Kansas 10-pointer, 170-inch deer on the ground at 5 yards. That's why we do what we do. And that hunt will probably forever change the way I think about hunting whitetails on the ground.